This is Crappy to Happy, and I am your host, Cass Dunn. I'm a clinical and coaching psychologist and mindfulness meditation teacher, and of course, author of the Crappy to Happy books. In this show, I bring you conversations with interesting, inspiring, intelligent people who are experts in their field and who have something of value to share that will help you feel less crappy and more happy. It is the start of a new year, and no doubt you have health goals you want to achieve. Despite all of my preaching not to set resolutions, I am sure that there are changes you want to make in your life to improve your overall health and well-being. The challenge we all face is knowing what are the key changes that will have the biggest impact. And then once we've got that sorted, how do we actually sustain those changes so that they become our new healthy habits? Remembering that the more your behaviors become habits, the less you have to rely on things like willpower and motivation, which will always desert you when you need them the most. Well, my guest today has the answer to both of those questions in the form of her brand new book called The Health Habit. Dr. Amantha Imber is an organizational psychologist. She is host of the top-rating podcast, How I Work, and she is founder of behavioral science consultancy, Inventium. She has worked with companies like Disney, Apple, and Google. She has a very long list of impressive accolades, including being named one of Australian Financial Review's top 100 women of influence. Most importantly, she is not only super smart, she's loads of fun. She's got plenty of fabulous advice to share with you today. So strap yourself in, grab a pen to take notes, and get ready to change your life for the better. Here is Amantha. Amantha, welcome to the Crappy to Happy podcast. Such a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, so good to be here.
I have been reading your latest book, and I think this is very, very timely because even though we are having this conversation in December, pretty sure this will be released in early January, just after Christmas, when everybody is in the throes of New Year's resolutions and how they're going to change their life in 2024. So this is perfect timing because, as we all know, many of us set goals, determine that we're going to make changes in our life and our behavior, improve our health, and then doesn't always go to plan. So you have the solution to this. Can you tell me about how Health Habits is, or what it's about and how it's kind of different to other maybe self-helpy kind of books?
Absolutely. So how the Health Habit came about is that I am like a massive health nerd. I'm just always experimenting just for fun, even though my day-to-day work involves behavior change, but really in the context of how we approach our work. And so health has always kind of been this kind of obsession/hobby on the side. And I've read so many health books, and I was thinking about just the number of health books that I've read and how those things work at bookstores. It's like every month there's some new health fad. Maybe it's a diet book or something like that we all go out and buy. And then we try it and nothing really sticks. And so we're back in the bookshop the next month buying the next healthy fad kind of book. And then in the meanwhile, there's this other section of the bookstore that's all about habit change. Like, how can you change your habits? How can you change your behavior? And as a psychologist, I love those books and I read them with interest. But I was having this thought one day as I was thinking, what should I write about next? And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if those two sections of the bookstore, those two kinds of books, actually met and kind of had a book baby? And so in The Health Habit, what I do is I go through some of the most impactful but underutilized strategies to improve our health. So specifically looking at how we sleep, how we move, and how we eat. And then the second part of the book is all around how do you make those new health habits stick? And so that was the idea for the book.
It's genius, to be honest. Like it really, it almost like is, how has nobody written this before? Because it's perfect. It's here's what you need to do. And then here is how you can make sure or give yourself the best chance of actually doing this. Now, I was really actually fascinated to read some of the research in the first part of the book, which is about the actual health habits. So I wanted to spend a bit of time touching on a few of these. People can get the book and they can read them all, but there are some of these that are really interesting. So let's start with sleep, because the book opens with sleep. Critically important, obviously. And it's a topic that comes up all the time, especially, amongst people that I talk to as well, about struggling with sleep. Maybe they've got young children, or maybe they just have anxiety, stress, difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep. It's a big thing that comes up in the psychology world, obviously. So what are some of the things that people can do to give themselves the best chance of getting a good night's sleep?
Well, one of the most important things that we can do is we can wake up at the same time every day, which sounds very simple, but it's generally not what people do. So what typically happens, I find, for adults that are working in a typical Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of job, is that they'll get up pretty early, Monday to Friday, and maybe they've also got kids to look after. Maybe they're doing the school run, so they're probably waking up at maybe 6, maybe 7 a.m. if they're lucky. And then the weekend comes and they're quite possibly sleeping in for an hour or two and going, that's fine. And then getting back to the 6 or 7 a.m. wake up on Monday. But what's actually happening is really quite problematic. Now, I live in Melbourne, Australia, and I often have to travel over the sea to New Zealand, which is about a 2-hour flight away, and also a 2-hour time zone difference. And whenever I go to New Zealand, I remember the 2-hour time zone difference, and I think that'll be fine. I won't even notice. But inevitably what happens is that I feel like breakfast when it's actually lunch, or vice versa. When it should be my bedtime, I'm wide awake or falling asleep at dinner, depending on which way I've gone. And I'm always surprised by that. And then after I've adjusted after a few days, it's time to go back home. And I again mistakenly think, I'll be fine. It's only a 2-hour time difference. But again, my body clock is completely screwed. Yeah. And this jet lag experience that we get, even from a couple of hours difference in the time zone, is pretty much what people are doing to themselves if they're having a bit of a sleep in on the weekend. So they're going, I'll be fine. I'll have a sleep in on the weekend. And you're feeling good because your body's getting an hour or two extra sleep. But when you hit Monday and you're back to your 6 or 7 a.m. wake up, it's essentially like you're putting yourself into a state of jet lag. Yeah. And then it takes you a few days to get over that jet lag. By the time it's the weekend, you're sleeping in, and then you're repeating that jet lag feeling when Monday comes around again. So waking at the same time will basically stop you from experiencing jet lag on a weekly basis.
And I read that in your book and I thought, wow, that's so interesting, because I now am doing some work over in Europe and there's a 1-hour time difference. It's a 45-minute flight. It's 1-hour time difference. You think it's nothing, but inevitably the night before, so I'll get there the night before, I'm wide awake when I know I should be in bed because I actually have to be up an hour earlier, according to my body. And it really throws you out. Just that 1 hour, it can really mess you up. It's 1 hour. On the upside, like I just came home and I'm like waking up fresh as a daisy at 5:30 in the morning and going, oh, actually, this is pretty good because I've adjusted to this 1 hour difference and I feel like I've got all this extra time now in the morning. But it really does make a difference.
It does. And look, another thing that we can do when it comes to sleep is very, very simple. So I imagine, Cass, that you, through your work in psychology, that you see a lot of people that are having a lot of stress and a lot of stressful thoughts. And often our stressful thoughts come to the forefront when it's time to go to sleep. Because what happens during the day is that we're on our phones, we're distracting ourselves from stress by scrolling through Instagram or watching TikTok videos and keeping the stressful thoughts at bay. But then when you're lying in bed and you're trying to get to sleep, your brain suddenly has time to open up this door of stressful thoughts, and that can keep you awake and make it really hard to get to sleep. So there's some really interesting research done, and it looked at how can we actually calm our brain down. And they had one group of people write essentially like a to-done list. They wrote all the tasks that they'd completed that day, and then they had another group write a to-do list. So they talked about all the tasks that they hadn't completed and had to do, and also thinking forward to the next few days, what were the things that they were going to have to do during their week. And they found that the group that completed the to-do list, so essentially got all these open loops, because something on your to-do list is an open loop that your brain is still juggling and holding. When they got it down on paper, it actually reduced their stress and helped them have a better quality night's sleep. So in this particular study, they were only spending 5 minutes writing this list. So it's a really great hack that if, half an hour before bed, before your head hits the pillow, just take 5 minutes, write yourself a to-do list, and you'll actually sleep a whole lot better.
I think that is really good. And I was actually speaking to somebody just the other day. She said whenever she wakes up during the night, let's say she wakes up at 2 or 3 in the morning, and it might just be like just because she gets up to go to the toilet and she comes back to bed. If she finds that there is things on her mind, she has a notebook and she writes things down and puts it aside and goes to bed. So does it work as well? Like if you wake up in the night, just write the things down, put it aside, go back to sleep?
Look, you certainly could. I know that the researchers didn't look at that specifically, but certainly, if you are having those middle of the night wake ups, the best thing to do, if you can't get back to sleep, say, within 10 or 15 minutes, because often we will just naturally go to sleep. We sleep in cycles of about 90 minutes. So every 90 minutes, it's really normal that, our brain will, kind of wake itself up and pop around and check for danger, as it did in the olden days. And if there's no danger, it'll just send itself back to sleep. But if you're finding that you're kind of lying there at 3 in the morning in bed and you're just not getting to sleep, this is going to sound really counterintuitive, but the best thing that you can do is get out of bed.
Yeah.
So the more time you spend in bed struggling to get to sleep, the worse your association with your bed becomes. It suddenly becomes a place where you don't sleep. And that's not what you want to feel about your bed. So if you're having that middle of the night wake up, and let's just say you haven't fallen asleep in 15 minutes, ideally move yourself to a different room, or even just get out of bed and, maybe if you've got, say, an armchair or something like that in your bedroom, just sit there and do a relaxing activity. So it might be meditation. It might be reading a book that is not the latest John Grisham thriller, but perhaps something a little bit more relaxing, something passive, and inevitably—
And not on your screen.
Not on your screen. Yes, exactly, Cass. Don't get your phone. Don't get that blue light in your eyes, because that will wake you up. But if you do that, eventually you'll catch another wave of sleep. When you feel that coming, go back to bed and hopefully you'll fall asleep.
That's a great one. And the other thing I found really interesting that you highlighted is that there's a lot of misconceptions out there about sleep. Like you said, it's natural to wake up, routinely through the night. And I guess most of us just don't even really remember it. We go back to sleep. But sometimes we do. Like I know there'll be once or twice during the night that I know that I'm awake, and then normally I will quickly fall back to sleep. But even like people expecting to wake up feeling really refreshed, and this idea of 8 hours sleep, like a lot of that is actually not 100% accurate.
Yeah. So in the health habit, I do quite a lot of myth busting, actually. So I interviewed a lot of professors from all around the world, a lot of other health experts around, what are some of these common misconceptions? And in this case, around sleep. And there's a lot. And they're ones that I definitely had. Like I remember one of the health experts I spoke to was this guy called Dr. David Cunnington, and he used to run the Melbourne Sleep Disorders Clinic. And I was telling David how often I would wake up and I would still feel pretty tired, but I'd get out of bed because I had to be somewhere, or I had to take my daughter to school, or there was some sort of obligation. But I would think to myself, I'm still pretty sleepy. I don't think I slept all that well. And then eventually I'd get on with the day and I'd be fine. But, in that first hour of the morning, I'd be quite critical of how poorly I had slept. And David told me something really interesting. He said that for 97% of us, our natural sleep-wake cycle is actually longer than 24 hours. On average, it's 24 hours and 20 minutes. And what that means, if your natural sleep-wake cycle is more than 24 hours, but you're waking at the same time every day, as opposed to, sleeping in just a few minutes every day, you're always going to feel that sense of sleep inertia. Because if you do, like the average person, have a sleep-wake cycle that's 24 hours and 20 minutes long, unless you're sleeping in 20 minutes every single day, which would completely put you out of loop with, with the normal sort of day-night norms that we all live by, you're going to wake up feeling tired. So he said the best way to judge whether you've had a good night's sleep is how you're feeling a couple of hours after you've woken up. So if you wake up at, say, 6:30 a.m., and you're doing all your morning duties and getting yourself ready, maybe getting your kids ready, and then perhaps by 8:30 or 9 o'clock, you're perhaps sitting at your desk and ready to start the workday, if you're a desk-based worker. See how you're feeling then. Because if you're feeling okay then, you're probably getting enough sleep.
That's so good to know, because so many people wake up feeling groggy, like you said, and then they're taking that as evidence that they've obviously not slept well. In actual fact, that's quite normal.
Exactly.
There you go. Everybody's normal. Everybody can calm down. There are so many other really good sleep tips, but the one that I wanted to really highlight, which I thought was so important, was the negative impact of sleeping pills and why we should be trying to avoid them. I think that's really important, because even I have been guilty of, well, maybe if sleep's really bad, given how important sleep is for every aspect of our health and well-being, as we now know, maybe taking some medication to make sure you're getting good sleep is actually not a bad thing in the short term. However, it is not a great solution. And look, I say this as someone who has taken sleeping pills at certain points. They're certainly really good as a jet lag hack when you're traveling across the world, like from Australia to Europe or to America, and you're just using a brute force approach, as I think of it, to get your body clock right back on track. But certainly since reading and understanding the research around sleeping tablets, I've stopped taking them, and I by and large just suffer through jet lag, which is not ideal. But what the research says around sleeping pills is that even taking sleeping pills infrequently, let alone frequently, quite dramatically increases our chance of having an early death. So it increases mortality rates quite significantly. There's not quite sure why it does that, but there's just been a lot of research to support it. So wherever possible, try not to resort to sleeping pills, because they are not good for your long-term health. Yeah, that's kind of scary. And is that just like things like, I'm not a doctor, but relaxant type of medication? Or what about things like melatonin that often people will take? Is that included in that?
Yeah, I don't think melatonin is included in that.
No, right.
But yeah, certainly I think that one of the biggest issues with melatonin is just the quality variance. It's very hard to know what you're actually getting in the little melatonin pill. But no, I think in terms of the prescription sleeping pills, it's classified differently in terms of that research.
Yeah. Okay, there is so much to cover, so I'm going to move on from sleep. But anybody who has difficulty with sleep, you've got so many really great, amazing tips. So I'm just going to refer people to the book. Now, movement. Everybody's got, well, unless you're a real fitness junkie and you're absolutely obsessed with going to the gym or you're a marathon runner, like most of us have a bit of a love-hate relationship. It's that thing that we think that we should do. We never feel like we're doing it enough. And I was so thrilled to read this 40-second hack.
Yes.
I want you to share with listeners how little exercise you actually need to do to achieve positive changes.
Yeah, look, it's pretty insane. So
it is.
Yes. So one of the professors that I interviewed, Martin Gabala, who's from McMaster's University, he specializes in exercise physiology and exercise science, and he's done some amazing research to basically go, what is the minimum possible dosage for improving our cardiovascular fitness? And what it turns out, contrary to, a lot of the health advice that says, make sure you're doing 30 minutes a day of moderate activity, like going for a brisk walk. Well, actually, what we now know from science is that doing 2 20-second all out intense bursts of exercise with a rest in between and also a warm up and a cool down will actually get you even better results. So doing that, so basically the protocol is do a warm up your body for a couple of minutes, then do 20 seconds of intense activity, which might be a sprint, it might be burpees, it might be going all out on an exercise bike, then just rest, do something sort of lower level for a couple of minutes, do another 20-second all-out sprint, and then cool down. Will get you the equivalent cardio benefits of having gone on a 45-minute jog.
That is amazing.
It is absolutely amazing. One company that I love actually in the UK, and I think that I was their first Australian user actually, is this company called Carol. And they make exercise bikes that are essentially AI powered, that are based on these same protocols that have been published in the research. So I bought one of these Carol bikes, I think 6 or 7 years ago, and it's essentially got these, they're called Rehit. Rehit is the kind of training. They've got these protocols actually programmed into the bike. And it's just, it's brilliant, but it's by far the most time effective way to improve your cardiovascular fitness quite dramatically without having to carve out like 30 or 60 minutes to go to the gym or go for a big long walk.
Yeah, exactly. I can hear people rejoicing right now as they hear that. You're telling me 2 20-second bursts is all it takes. And okay, so how many times a week would they need to do that?
Look, they say ideally 3 times a week is enough to increase your VO2 max, which is the most reliable indicator of your cardiovascular fitness. So that's all you need to do.
So that's for cardiovascular fitness. Presumably, like there are benefits also to things like lifting weights, doing strength training, right? So there's other things before we all get too carried away. There are other things that we ideally should be doing.
That's exactly right. So you also definitely want to do something, the researchers call it musculoskeletal fitness, if you like. So that's basically like doing something to improve your strength and muscle mass, which is particularly important as we get older, because the more successfully we've been able to build up our muscles, the more that protects us from doing things like having a fall or having, limited movement or limited ability to do the sorts of movements that a lot of us take for granted before we enter old age. But again, there is a section around, again, what is the minimum viable dose, if you like, for improving our muscle mass and our strength. And you don't have to do all that much. So in the chapter about strength training or weight training, there's really just 3 movements that you need to incorporate into a strength workout. One is a pushing movement, which might be as simple as a push-up, like a body weight push-up. One is a pulling movement, so like a bent over row, where you might have some weights or something heavy in your hands, like filled up water bottles or something like that. And then ideally some sort of a movement where you're hinging at the hip, like a squat, for example. And again, you can do a body weight squat. And ideally, if you start by just doing one set of each of those movements, if you're brand new to strength training, that is absolutely a great starting point, and you will start to see gains. Obviously, when you start to plateau, you want to add in, some more training sessions and some more sets, but that is absolutely where you can start to see some results.
I feel like this is just such good news. There are so many people who struggle to start. And I know we'll get to the psychology and the motivation and stuff in a minute, but there are so many people who struggle to start because it just feels like too much to have to do. So bringing this down to the bare minimum that you need to do, it makes it very achievable. For the average person, the busy person, there's loads of reasons why many of us are not getting, doing the exercise that we know that we need. And this is just music to our ears. I know it's music to mine. I was ready to go, hallelujah, I can do this. I can do that. So again, there's like loads of other little tips in there that people can go and read, but I want to move on because the other really important part of overall health is nutrition. And I think this is the one that people get really stuck on. There is just so much confusing information out there. We should be like no sugar and cut out carbs, but then then there's people who are just fully carnivore, and then, I don't know, just meat. Like, they just eat meat now. That's what I keep hearing. Like, we went from just be plant-based to now, like, no, we don't eat vegetables. I'm like, what the hell? So what are some of the basics, I guess, when it comes to nutrition that we all need to, again, what's the minimum that we can all be doing to give ourselves the best chance of eating well?
Yeah, and it is interesting because I think nutrition is where you'll find the least agreement between scientists and researchers. So this was probably the most challenging section of the book to write. It was asking the question, what are the things that are universally agreed on, but are essentially not just teaching people to suck eggs? We all know that we need to eat vegetables. Like
not the carnivores.
Not the carnivores, except for the carnivores. Yes, they're like just steak on my plate, please. But there are things that are universally agreed. Like, for example, you've probably heard about blood glucose or blood sugar levels, and what we eat has a huge impact on those. What scientists will agree on is that the more stable we can keep our blood glucose or blood sugar levels, I use those terms interchangeably, the better our health will be. If we're getting massive spikes and then drops, that is not good, and certainly increases our chance of getting diabetes, and also just on a day-to-day level, feeling like rubbish. Like if you're finding that you're moody, if you're having like that, 3 p.m. mid-afternoon energy slump, if you're just feeling like tired and grumpy, or maybe hungry, soon after you've actually eaten a meal, chances are your blood glucose level is not stable. It's peaking, it's spiking, and then it's like dropping. And that is making you feel pretty crap day to day. So there are a few tips in the book, and also in the movement section as well, around how can we stabilize our blood glucose levels. Probably my one of the most surprising things I found when I was researching this chapter is that the order in which we eat our food actually matters. So I reckon, I'm sure you're familiar with the marshmallow test, which, in terms of a test of willpower in kids, and obviously, it's debatable how valid and reliable that research actually was. But I think as a kid, like I was pretty disciplined, I was pretty conscientious. I reckon I would have done well at the marshmallow test and just resisting that marshmallow. And certainly when I'm eating a meal, I find that I will just naturally adopt a save the best for last philosophy. So if there's vegetables on my plate, and there's also potatoes or chips or something like that, I will always eat the vegetables first because I want to save the best for last. But it turns out there's science behind my eating philosophy. So there was some really interesting research that looked at, your average meal that consists of vegetables, some protein, like some chicken, for example, and some carbs like rice or pasta or something like that. And one group were asked to eat the vegetables first, then the protein and the fats, like let's just say there was some olive oil or something like that, and then finally the carbs like the rice. And then another group were asked to eat it in the opposite order, so starting with the carbs and finishing with the vegetables. What they found is that the group that ate the vegetables first and the carbs last had significantly more stable blood glucose levels. So if you're having a meal where it is kind of segmented into those different sections, try to eat your vegetables first and try to eat the carbs last, and then have the protein and the fats in the middle. Obviously, that doesn't work for every meal. If you're eating spaghetti bolognese, you're going to look totally neurotic if you're trying to apply this philosophy, but where you can, it's going to help you feel a lot better.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so I know that you talked to Jessie and Chowsby, the glucose goddess, for your book. I also have had her on the podcast. So just for listeners, if they're interested in that, you can always go back and listen to that conversation with Jessie. And in fact, note to self, I think she's got a new, like a recipe book out or something. So I should probably get her back on the show as well and get an update from her. But so interesting. And so speaking of that and the blood glucose levels, which I also think is just so interesting and really important, it really just brings it back to basics. Like, never mind what you're eating or what can you do to maintain those blood glucose levels? Because what Jessie also said was that, the reason that keto diets, for example, work is for that reason, because they maintain a consistent blood glucose level. But if you can eat those other foods, if you can just find a way to eat them so that you're still maintaining that stable kind of blood glucose, which again
Yeah.
is music to many people's ears. You don't have to cut them out completely, just eat them last.
Exactly.
So what about the blood glucose monitor? Because that's how Jessie got started, right? Is by monitoring her, tracking her own response to what she was eating. And I know you've used it too, haven't you, Amantha? So can you talk about that? And is that something that people generally, you would recommend that you do, to just, yeah, okay, let's hear that.
100%. So I am a massive fan of experimentation. And in the health habit, I talk about just having the mindset of an experimenter. And with any of these health habits, try to adopt just a 7-day experiment. Like anyone can do anything for 7 days. And, given that I do have this experimental mindset, something that I've always been interested in is how different kinds of foods that we eat have quite a different impact on our blood glucose levels. So what is really interesting in research is that, like, the media will give us these broad brush pieces of advice, like eat wholemeal bread, don't eat white bread, because white bread's bad for us in inverted commas, and wholemeal bread is always good. But what we actually know is that people have a very individualized response to particularly how their body deals with carbohydrates. And so some people can eat white bread and their blood glucose will be completely stable, whereas other people, it will have a massive spike and then a massive dip. And then they might have the opposite effect with wholemeal bread. And this got me really curious. And so I thought, I'm going to get one of those continuous blood glucose monitors, or a CGM as they're called, continuous glucose monitor. And I also bullied my partner into doing the same thing because I didn't want to be alone in this experiment. Yeah. And so we bought these devices. So in terms of what they look like, if you imagine like a table tennis ball squashed, it's kind of like sort of a round piece of plastic that's got a needle on it. And like as soon as I hear needle, I think, ouch, that sounds really scary. But don't be scared. Even though what is happening, this device is sitting kind of like where your tricep is at the back of your arm and the needle is piercing through your skin. You don't actually feel it. And it doesn't actually, much to my surprise, it doesn't actually hurt to put the blood glucose monitor on. So you stick it on and then it just stays there for 2 weeks with the brand that I was using. And then you've got an app and you can scan the little blood glucose monitor with your phone and you'll get a reading of what your blood glucose levels are doing at any time of day. And so then what I did and what my partner did is we ran a whole bunch of food experiments. So we'd put together like all the different kinds of meals that we eat and then we'd see what they did to our blood glucose levels. So there were some real surprises in there. Probably the biggest surprise for both of us is that we both actually like porridge. And I would say most health experts would say, porridge, that's a healthy food. Like, shouldn't we all be eating porridge for breakfast? But actually, both of us had massive spikes from eating porridge.
Wow.
And so we've kind of stripped that out of our diet thanks to that experiment. Wow.
Because it's just straight carbs, isn't it? Like it's just, is that right? It's a big bowl of starch.
Yeah, it is majority carbohydrates, but some other foods like that are majority carbohydrates, like let's take a carrot, for example, didn't have that impact.
No,
so
right.
It's not so much that the majority in terms of the macronutrients are carbohydrates, it's that particular carbohydrate, that particular food just didn't really gel with my body in terms of providing me with a good type of energy. Instead, it gave me a big peak and a big trough.
That's so interesting. Are they very expensive? Do you just like hire it for? How does this work?
Good question. So the one that we used was about $100. Okay. So it's not cheap, but also for the valuable data that you're getting from it, and you're getting 2 weeks worth of data, I think that it's money well spent. I mean, you could easily blow $100 on dinner out. And I think far better to get the data on what you should actually be eating when you're going out for said dinner.
I guess it's like being really intentional, isn't it? For that 2 weeks, like you said, really track and monitor and make the most of that period of time. I'm going to look into that because I think that's really interesting. I just wanted for you to make one more tip about the nutrition side, and there's loads more, as we know, because I'm not necessarily a sweet tooth. I have a little bit of chocolate every now and again, but it's not something I really crave. Like I wouldn't say I have a sugar addiction, but I am a salt fiend. Like I salt and over salt to the point, like my husband says, oh, Just a few chips with your salt then? Like literally chips are just like a vehicle to get more salt into my body. And so this thing about highly palatable food, it's a term I had not heard before, but I thought it was a very relevant one because I think this is most of our problem, right? It's the stuff that tastes really good that is our downfall. So what is the solution?
Yeah. So the section on hyperpalatable food is interesting. And, look, it basically explains why it is really hard to say no to sweet things and salty things. So there's actually a formula that scientists have worked out that determine whether something is defined as hyperpalatable. In other words, highly addictive is essentially the outcome because it's activating the reward center of our brain. And basically it's about like the ratio of things like saltiness or the sodium amount that's in foods and how much fat there is and then how much sugar there is. And there are some sort of magical formulas that don't exist in naturally occurring food, but certainly exist a lot with very processed foods. So what happens? Like if we're eating normal food that hasn't been heavily processed or tampered with by food manufacturers, it sends the right kind of signals to our body and our body is able to work out. And more importantly, our brain is able to work out when you have had enough. When your brain says, I'm full, I'm going to stop eating. And so therefore you eat the amount that your body requires to fuel itself during the day. But if you're eating more of the hyperpalatable foods, which are typically very processed, they're typically sweet or they're typically very salty, like, anything from muesli bars to donuts and muffins to chips and, fried bacon, those sorts of things, is that our brain, it's like our brain doesn't receive the signal that we've had enough. Instead, our brain is like, oh my gosh, my reward center is being activated. I must have more and more and more. And we become really bad at judging how much we need. And that leads to overeating, which then leads to excess weight gain, which then can lead to a lot of health problems. So ideally, we want to try to have ultra processed foods, be only about 10% of our diet, ideally.
Yeah. Good tip. And then you also talk about like weaning ourselves off some of those flavors. And I thought, I might have to give that a crack. I might have to try to just less salt because you're right. Your palate does adjust, doesn't it? If you cut something out for a while and then you go back to it, it tastes like super sickly sweet or overly salty. So it is just what we get used to. So we can wean ourselves off those things.
We absolutely can. And certainly several of the scientists and professors that I spoke to for the book said, look, it typically takes a few weeks. And I can certainly attest to that myself. So, I've spent a lot of my life being a massive sugar addict. Like I would require sweet treats, chocolate, mixed lollies, you name it, several times a day. I was that addicted. And for me, it all culminated when about 10 years ago when my daughter was 3 months old. And I remember when I was pregnant, like I had a little ritual where I'd catch the train home from work, and at the train station there was a lolly shop that sold all these mixed lollies, and I'd get a bag of lollies, on the commute home every night and eat them. And then when my daughter was born and I was a very sleep deprived mum, there's no better source of energy than chocolate in my mind. So I ate a lot of it. And then one night when she was 3 months old, I just put her to bed and I was in the kitchen and I needed a hit of sweetness. And I looked in the fridge and there was nothing sweet in the fridge. It was all really boring, unprocessed foods. The pantry, there was nothing in the pantry. But what there was a Tupperware full of raw sugar. And I thought, that'll have to do. And so I got the Tupperware out and I got a teaspoon and I started eating raw sugar from the Tupperware. And at that point, my husband, he's now my ex-husband, not for this reason, but he saw me and he's like, what are you doing? And I just said, I needed something sweet. And at that moment, I thought, this has got too much. Here I am at night spooning raw sugar out of Tupperware. And so I ended up going cold turkey on sugar.
Wow.
I quit, and since then, for the last 10 years, sugar is no longer, and chocolate is no longer a daily habit for me, through applying a lot of the strategies in the book. But what I do remember after being off sugar for a few weeks is how sweet things like carrots and pumpkin taste when you're not filling your taste buds with hyperpalatable foods that have been artificially designed to be intensely sweet and trick your brain into eating more.
Yeah. So you just got to get through that initial withdrawal and then it all stabilizes back to normal. I think that's really, it's good for people to know that. Okay, the psychology of it. As much as we know what we need to do, and as much as this all sounds very doable, we know that human nature is that we start, we stop, we fall off the wagon. We find it really difficult to remain committed and motivated to some of these behavior changes, but you've got a whole second half of the book devoted to, which we won't spend that much time on, but devoted to what we can do to give ourselves the best chance of success. And I think this is going to be really interesting to people too. So, Amantha, do you just want to give us some ideas about what some of those things are? I'll just throw it over to you to give listeners some ideas about, what are the things that might help.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's really important to recognize when you're trying to make a new habit stick, and in the case of the health habit, they're habits around your health, but really with any habit, what's important is that you first identify what's the biggest barrier in the way of you making a successful change. And it's different for different people. So for example, when COVID hit a few years ago, and I'm in Melbourne, which I think is the lockdown capital of the world.
Think
we had the most days in lockdown, not a title that we're proud of. But what we could do is that we were allowed to leave the house for 1 hour a day during lockdown. And I had two friends during this time that were trying to create a walking habit to, improve their health. And one of my friends thought, I'm going to do the walk in the morning, get it out of the way. And so for the first week, she went for a 1 hour walk every morning. My other friend thought, I'm going to do it at the end of the workday. And so for the first week, she stuck to that walking habit every day after work. But then in the second week, they both ran into problems, but they were quite different. So my morning walker friend, what she found is that because she was going quite early for these walks and she was making a bit of noise when she was getting into her walking gear, her partner started waking up and getting a little bit grumpy. And when you're locked down with someone 24/7, you kind of don't want any additional conflict. And so she just thought, this is all too hard. I'm going to stop the walks because I don't want to create conflict with my partner. My other friend who was walking in the evening, she, in that second week, got hit with a massive work project, and she found that she was just in back-to-back Zoom meetings all day, and then she was at her computer until the wee hours of the morning. And so out went her walking habit because she was just too exhausted and also too busy. So the exact same health habit, but two really different things that were getting in the way. So for my early morning walk friend, we call that a relational barrier, where it's about the people around you and the social norms that are sometimes getting in the way of you making a change. But for my evening walk friend, it was around just that cognitive barrier of just being too exhausted to make a change. There are two other kinds of barriers as well that I talk about in the book. There's motivational barriers where you feel like you have to make a change. Maybe your doctor has said you need to make this change, or your partner has said you need to change, but you don't really want to make that change. So it's sort of have to versus want to. So motivation's lacking. And then there are environmental barriers. And this is about the physical environment that we find ourselves in. So for example, we're talking about hyper palatable foods. And if your pantry is full of chocolate bars and various other, chip packets and crackers and all those sorts of things, then there's probably going to be some environmental barriers standing in your way to reducing HPFs. So the book, firstly, helps you diagnose what is the main barrier standing in the way. And then it's a bit choose your own adventure. You go to the section that relates to your barrier.
That's so helpful because it is a really personalized approach, isn't it? Like you've really laid it out so that you can kind of work out what's getting in the way and then find a strategy that will overcome that. I was very pleased to see the inclusion of what I call a star chart, because that is something that I recommend to people all the time. What's yours
Yes.
called? Oh, streaks.
A streak board.
Let's talk about a streak board for a second.
Absolutely. So a streak board is really great if you have got a motivational barrier in the way. So what a streak board is it is some kind of visual representation that when you do your habit, let's say it's one that you're doing every day, that you give yourself a star or a tick on this streak board. And what happens over time is that just psychologically, we don't want to break the streak. Now, there are a lot of different apps that have used this idea of the sort of the streak board psychology really well. Like if you've ever tried to learn a new language and you've used Duolingo, for example, you'll have seen a streak.
Husband. That's my husband. He's like up to 600 and something days without a break. And he is so committed to continuing that streak. It is really fascinating. I mean, it's quite impressive.
It is very motivating. I know when I was working on the manuscript for The Health Habit, I had a streak board up in my home office, and I had a word count goal every day. I was writing 1,000 words that I could feel proud of. And if I did that, I got to put a little smiley face on my streak board. And that is what got me through certainly the initial 6 weeks when I was trying to turn my writing into a habit to submit the manuscript on time.
The other reason I always recommend that one too is because with the people that I have, worked with, and I've involved in an online fitness community for several years, is that this all or nothing thinking takes over as soon as they eat a bad meal or skip a day of workout. And so for me, it's like, well, it really helps to keep it in perspective. If you've got this visual representation of all the times that you've done the right thing, then that one bad thing, instead of going into that negative self-critical, I'm such a failure, I never stick to anything, it really helps to keep it in perspective.
It definitely does.
The other thing that I noticed also works for me, and I noticed it was also in the book, is what you call temptation bundling. That is, you tell everybody what that is.
Yeah, this is a big favorite of mine, and certainly when I'm trying to change a habit and my motivation is lacking, because again, this is a really good one. If motivation is the barrier standing in the way, what you want to do is you want to make the change desirable. That is sort of the overarching strategy. But this is how temptation bundling works. So in my life, I mentioned that I've got an exercise bike, the Carol bike. And while I don't need to spend a long time on it, I still just don't enjoy it. And sometimes I do sort of longer workouts on it, but I find it miserable. I find exercise bikes utterly boring. What I do like is that I have, and I'm about to lose all credibility, I think, with listeners, is that I have a very unhealthy obsession with The Bachelor and The Bachelorette reality TV. Has to be the US series, because that really
very specific,
the bitchiest and lowest common denominator one, I think.
I love it.
So anyway, I love it, but I feel intense guilt when I sit on the couch to watch the particular TV series. And so what I decided is to pair bike riding and The Bachelor together. So when I am on the Carol bike, I get my iPad and I balance it on the screen on the bike and I watch The Bachelor. And what it does is that it makes the bike riding so much more enjoyable. And it also means that what was a very guilty pleasure, watching The Bachelor or Bachelorette, is that it's now just a pleasure. So temptation bundling is taking the thing that you really don't want to do, where your motivation is low, and pairing that with something that brings you a lot of pleasure and joy. So bike riding and The Bachelor.
And I do the same sometimes with podcasts, but the kind of podcasts that are almost like a series, like a story that continues. I'm listening to one at the moment, and I say, oh, I'm going to listen to that while I go for a walk or walk the dogs or something like that. And it just motivates me. Like, I can't wait to get out of the house.
Yes.
To put that thing in my ears and have my time to listen to that.
I'm exactly the same, Cass. I divide my podcasts into 2 types of podcasts. There's one that are pure joy and entertainment, and then there are ones that are educational. And I listen to my, purely for fun and joy and entertainment when I'm doing things like generally related to exercise, but when I'm, say, in the car, and I'm like, well, being in the car is fine. I'm going to listen to my educational podcasts.
Yes. I think that's a really good point too. Like, if it's something that you feel like one of those have to things, like listening to something that's educational, then don't pair it with something else that you have to. Mix them up so that you're actually adding something that's fun to something that you don't necessarily feel like doing. Good tip.
Exactly.
There's so many others. I think that those are really useful as a starting point. The book is called The Health Habit. Everybody can go out and get it. I think it's a perfect time of year to go and buy it. And let me tell you, like, I was fully engaged. Like, I was powering through that book going, this is so interesting. There are so many really, as a psychologist, interesting psychological studies and, the research. It makes for a really good read, and it's also just really practical and super helpful. So thank you so much for your time today, Amantha. It's just been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Cass. Thank you.